medical school or university missions around Australia and New Zealand, and many others, as you know, ended up in books. Some of those books took a long time to write. Some were in the writing until just 3 weeks ago. Telephone call, I have finished. Instructions as to where the tapes were and who was going to unlock the tapes, Andy. And the fact that the story that had been longest in writing, but one which many of us had heard bits of at those General Committee meetings, had finally been written. It's a story that's an interesting one because it ties up with the word meek that was used by Dennis just now, the story of Moses. It was a story that had plagued him for many years. He didn't know how to write it. But I always felt that Moses was very similar to Dr. Hercus in the sense that they were both engineers. They both knew the text extraordinarily well, and they both, by example, made us go back to them again and again and to hear what they had read and hear what they'd written. There was another memory of the General Committee meetings that I'd like to mention, and that is the patience of those of us who had questions. We came as student leaders and as graduate leaders, but full of questions. And we found with him somebody who was prepared to listen to them and to suggest that there were answers that were personal questions for us, and there were also intellectual and other types of questions which you may or may not have been asked to answer. And he was somebody who constantly helped us to realise that if we had questions, we could turn them into excuses for responding to God, or we could wrestle with those questions because all questions come from God. And in one of the most exciting pieces of his writing, which has not yet been published, but which has had 3 revisions, a manuscript called God, 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 Man, Man, Man. In the very last or second last page, he has this to say about those questions. And I was intrigued in reading the manuscript just 12 months ago to find that he'd spoken about questions, because dealing with them, having them myself and seeing the way he dealt with others' questions was so characteristic of his generosity and caring, listening to them and helping them to understand why God had given them questions. This is what he wrote. I am not asked to answer your questions any more than you are asked to answer mine. God asks in each life only for the answers that must come from the one single individual. What about the starving millions? What about the ghastly story of Vietnam? What about Auschwitz? What answers do I have to those? I have to reply, none. I am not directly asked for the answers of those questions, and I am not to presume to tell God what to ask me. He has in fact asked me the questions that come to me in my life here in Sydney as John Hercus. Well, that was the challenge which graduates and students throughout Australia were given by him, a person who humbly sought to encourage us within the middle of our vocation to realise that our vocation was given to us in order to find God. We had the opportunity of responding to him in obedience or otherwise. And it was a great privilege and pleasure to have this close friendship with him as a student and then in the IVF, together with many other graduates, and to learn how to respond as he so wonderfully did. We thank God for his life.
John Hercus was a doctor who worked in a highly technical field. He was a master craftsman who will be remembered with gratitude by many whose sight he restored. But he was a doctor who also saw the man or the woman behind the eyes. The patient as a human being had for him a significance that far transcended the importance of eyesight, important though that is. He focused his skills on the technicalities of his profession, and his peers regarded those skills as surpassed by very few in our times. But the human personality whose sight was the subject of that encounter was also the object of John's intense scrutiny. To be absorbed in the treatment of the eyes to the exclusion of the lifelong well-being of the whole person would always have been for him a betrayal of the trust which the patient reposed in him. But far more important, a betrayal also of an infinitely more weighty responsibility which he saw as placed on him by God. John entered medicine the hard way. The 1930s were difficult years for the son of a clergyman with no worldly resources to begin life as a student, hoping to enter one of the professions. The story of John's student days in those Depression years needs more time than I have now. Suffice it to say that he displayed courage, resourcefulness, and great perseverance to achieve medical graduation in 1942. As a student, he worked at an astonishing variety of jobs at a time when work was hard to come by. I only learned yesterday that he taught physics and chemistry at Trinity Grammar School for 2 years while grappling with his senior medical years. Most jobs he tackled were less genteel. Qualifying as an optometrist also provided resources and helped set a direction. While still in his senior years as a medical student, he met Dr. Gregory Roberts, and this began an association which lasted for over 40 years. The older man clearly saw in John a potential as yet undeveloped. The influence and guidance of Gregory Roberts began in John's year as a resident medical officer. Even before entering the army, his interest had been aroused and first steps taken towards ophthalmology. During his army service as an ophthalmologist, that course was fixed. John and I served in the same army hospital, the 2nd AGH in North Queensland, for the final year of the war. We had a great deal in common, old friends, both sons of clergymen, brought up in a rather pietistic environment, both recently married and with infant sons, and thrown into the army. The war had violently disrupted plans for our lives, but it had given us both uncommon professional opportunities. John's approach to army life was characteristic. Unconventional, but positive. He worked hard, made friends, and started a choral society. I never knew a man who could refuse an unwanted invitation so graciously. After our discharge, we both entered specialist practice in surgery. He as an assistant in Sydney, he as an assistant to Dr. Gregory Roberts, and later as partner. We were both foundation members of the Christian Medical Fellowship, and we both settled down with our growing families to build a new life in a rapidly changing world. I would identify 2 things as paramount in John's practice of medicine. One was his professional integrity in the quality of work he demanded of himself. Only perfection in diagnosis, technique, and results was good enough. The second was in a way derived from the first and only legitimized by his exacting standard of professional excellence. It was never to leave untouched any aspect of a patient's welfare to which he could direct some positive thought or idea, to lift a drooping spirit, encourage the faint-hearted, or direct the thoughts of the careless to the claims of God on our lives. In those things, John has set us a noble example. The Master's "Well done, good and faithful servant" is his reward.
Our next hymn has a special significance because it was a hymn that was sung at John and Marjorie's wedding. But it wasn't just for him a nice thought to have on a wedding day. This was the experience of his whole life. And indeed, we know that it is his experience still. Oh, the deep, deep love of Jesus.
No wonder we do not lose heart. Though our outward humanity is in decay, yet day by day we are inwardly renewed. Our troubles are slight and short-lived, and their outcome an eternal glory which outweighs them far. Meanwhile, our eyes are fixed, not on the things that are seen, but on the things that are unseen. For what is seen passes away, what is unseen is eternal. For we know that if the earthly frame that houses us today should be demolished, we possess a building which God has provided, a house not made by human hands, eternal and in heaven. In this present body we do indeed groan. We yearn to have our heavenly habitation put on over this one, in the hope that being thus clothed, we shall not find ourselves naked. We groan indeed, we who are enclosed within this earthly frame. We are oppressed because we do not want to have the old body stripped off. Rather, our desire is to have the new body put on over it, so that our mortal part may be absorbed into life immortal. God himself has shaped us for this very end, and as a pledge of it, he has given us the Spirit.